Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be talking about the participation in the workforce globally of young people, or maybe more precisely, the lack thereof. With us today is John Russo, who is a visiting scholar at Georgetown University and a specialist in analyzing the working poor and middle class employment, author of Steeltown, USA, Work and Memory, all about Youngstown, and Rob Koepp. Rob is the executive director of Chapman's Asia Pacific Geoeconomics and Business Initiative, and is an expert on China. He ran the Economists Executive Network in East Asia. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we'll start with this question, which it really applies to both of you, but maybe I'll start with Rob here. There's all this talk, low unemployment rate, low labor shortages, yet it does seem that in China, the US, Japan, Europe, the participation of young people in the workforce seems to be lessening. Is that accurate for Asia? John can address what's happening here, but is that happening in Asia? We always think of Asia as a bunch of workaholics.
Yeah. Yes, it is, but for different reasons. So I think what we see in the US and maybe other parts of the Western world, this kind of quiet quitting, the Great Resignation, I like to take a more longitudinal, holistic view. I think of that as somewhat positive. It's a quality of life issue, I think, by and large. We could maybe debate that and be interested in John's thoughts as well. But what's going on in Asia is fundamentally different. It's they're not having babies. This is really, it first began in Japan, but then we've now seen it in South Korea, even Taiwan, which is kind of the better version of mainland China, democracy and freedom and all that, but still a Chinese society. Even there, they're suffering through this. But China's really taking it on the chin because of their draconian population control policies, coupled with what's now a stagnating economy and stifling political environment. So it's the same but different.
But what about this whole question of lying flat? You read about.
I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe explain to our listeners what lying flat means.
So that's the English translation of the Mandarin pronunciation of tangping, which means to lie flat. And I know Marshall, he maybe doesn't often admit, also speaks some Chinese, so we can maybe debate various phrasing here. But but to me, when you think of that, lying flat as opposed to quiet quitting, to me, quiet quitting is like, I'm going to go do something more interesting. It reminds me of the sitcom, was it Portlandia? Where it's like, where 20-somethings go to retire. Right? You know that's what Portland is. But the idea, the skit was always about, they would go to Portland and do something. It wasn't giving up on life. It was just thinking like, take this job and shove it, to bring up another musical analogy there. Whereas tangping, that's like Taoist monk type, retreat into a cave and meditate. That's just getting out of society, which, by the way, as that reference brings up, there's a historical analogy there, but typically when you see that happen throughout Chinese history, that's when people have really thought, I can't take this anymore. I'm getting out of society. So it's a little bit different. I think what we see in the West is younger people wanting a better kind of life, and so it's aspirational, whereas in China, it has the ring of hopelessness. I would say the same thing with this kind of voluntary, childless couples, or just men and women, particularly on the female side, females in Asia just not wanting to get married and have children. They're rejecting what's expected of them at all. And then on top of that, one other thing I'll just throw in is, of course, the U.S., it doesn't matter if to be blunt about it, if white folks stop having kids, we've got immigration. And that scares the MAGAs of the nation because they think of it as replacement theory, but it's it's a phenomena because we are a nation of immigrants.
Yeah, but
And so
so,
we're able to, yeah.
the question though is are we seeing a drop in workforce participation by younger people in the U.S., John? I mean, and what is that? What is that? Is this coming out of this changed view of society that Rob is talking about in China, or is it coming from someplace else?
I think right now it's coming out because of the pandemic. Pandemic really changed the whole formulation of the workforce. We had increasingly older people who basically said, I'm not going to live like this anymore. I'm going to quit. I'm going to go back and live another type of life that I may have wanted for a long time. And younger people are not coming in to fill into those jobs because maybe they don't want them. I mean, it's always interesting. I don't know, it's the same for you guys at Chapman, but at Youngstown State, you had a lot of ex-steel workers, ex-auto workers trying to get retrained, reskilled. And then when they finished, there wasn't any jobs out there that paid anywhere near the amount of money that they were making. And I saw and met a lot of them over the years, and I was there for 40 years, is that they just gave up, or they got involved in their hobbies, cars, and and things like that. There was no hope for them. That's because you get to be 45 and 50 and you've lost your job, you're not going to reskill real quick. So you've got that generation. So that's one particular problem. But I think the pandemic really exacerbated all that. And the thing that during the pandemic that people don't acknowledge, and I think, is the expansion of technological innovation and displacement. And so what is the future of work? That's the question I'm sort of asking is, what are the future of work and what will be the arrangements?
You think about the question of that most people who are getting into having to earn a living in order to survive, think about, which is, I've got to start someplace. I've got to take some job to be able to pay the rent. I've got to, have some obligation, and it may be uncomfortable, may not be the perfect thing, but I've got to start somewhere. It seems that very notion is actually eroding, right? You could live in your parents' basement. You can, the impetus to actually take the bull by the horns and participate in society from an obligatory perspective, right? I've got to survive. That seems to be eroding on both sides of the Pacific.
But, if I can seize a little bit on John's point about the technology and AI, China and America are the dominant powers in artificial intelligence. Is this on people's minds? As maybe, I know that I have young, my daughters will talk about AI as, I wanted to do A, but now AI is going to replace it. Is this something, John, that you hear? And is it also something that you're hearing in China?
Well, I'm certainly hearing it. I've been hearing it for a long time, that the idea of technological displacement is pretty important. I want to just stop for 1 second and ask, when we talk about work ethics, we don't see anything about employers' employment ethics.
That's a great point.
And so I think as we discuss this, as the changes in the modes and the means of production, Joel, you know the term, and how that all sort of plays out in this rapidly changing world, and what does it mean to younger people? A lot of my students, and again, I don't know the students at Chapman, but for many years, the idea they were the sons and daughters of steel workers and auto workers and hospital workers, and they came through the workforce and they were going to be skilled and get a better job. But those jobs never appeared. And so there's a great disillusionment about the future of work, because this is where I see the problems, is that increasingly people can either say, screw it, I'm going to just get out of society as we know it, and we're just going to get by taking precarious jobs, one job to another, in order to survive, because I think precarity is no longer just the first 5 years out of college. It is 40% of the workforce, according to recent studies, is, has precarious work. So, and precarious work isn't all bad. It's some of it is, but there's changes that are going on in terms of work and how much work there will be available.
Well, that's a really good point, John. I mean, if the employers aren't willing to commit to the talent, why would the talent be willing to commit to the employer? Right. And so the whole notion that we used to have, which is, hey, I'll bring you along and you'll progress within my organization if I'm the employer, is now kind of like, well, I can use you as long as I need you, and I have no obligation to continue to use you afterwards.
I'd like to follow this up in terms of Asia. I wrote one of the first pieces ever about the Shinjin-rui in Japan, the new race, where the Japanese work ethic began to drop. A lot of them were doing precarious jobs, delivering sushi on a bicycle or something instead of a career. Is that happening in China? And also, do Chinese companies feel any more obligation than American companies to provide a future for their employees?
Yes and no. To tie in quickly to your point about Japan, because I think that is interesting. So maybe around the time you wrote your piece, it was very popular in Japan to talk about how people were rejecting what they called the 3Ks. Kitsui, kitanai, kiken. So kitsui would be like low pay, kitanai, dirty, kiken, dangerous. So any of those jobs, it's like they just stayed away from. So that there, it's more like a kind of voluntary unemployment, right? In China, I mean, the latest statistics for June of this year is 21.3% youth unemployment. That's for ages 16 to 24. And then the government said, we're not going to continue to report this. The statistic was so embarrassing. So what I've heard about that is you've got the college graduates who are actually interested in joining the workforce. But then to your question there, Joel, about what are the employers offering, the employers tell them, well, it's a 996. Mm-hmm. So that's the infamous, it sounds like John knows about that. 996 system is, a thing of the past. I mean, that's like, early 20th century. Yeah, it's 9 to 9, 6 days a week, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And it's the pay is like, we complain about millennials in the States, but these are jobs that don't even pay what the World Bank would consider middle income.
I mean, these are service jobs that pay so
well, factory jobs.
It's entry level, typically entry level. So Jack Ma, for example, the West likes to celebrate Jack Ma as this visionary entrepreneur, and not to take anything away from the companies he built, notably Alibaba and so forth, but Jack Ma is famous for recently coming out in public and saying, and he's no old timer himself, but he came out saying like a grumpy grandpa when he said, young people need to buckle down and work harder. I mean, that's what's going wrong. But Alibaba is famous, just like Amazon under Bezos, again, a celebrated entrepreneur, but these guys are not known for really providing hospitable, very, personally rewarding work opportunities. So I think that's also part of the problem. It's even in tech, but you're right, Joel. I mean, of course, if you can't get into Alibaba or one of the big tech companies, which at least has more prestige and glamour associated with it, for the vast majority, I mean, everywhere in the world, most employers are smaller companies and they're not necessarily big names. It can be even rougher because they just don't have the same resources.
So in the US, is this one of the reasons why we're seeing a resurgence of organized labor?
I would hope so, but as a student of labor law, there are real limits to it. I think we are seeing it, but I think when you try to organize some of the tech companies, it becomes very difficult. It's very expensive, and unions don't have the resources to do that very easily, and plus the law itself is lousy. I mean, I've taught labor law for 40 years, and I regularly said it's the worst labor law in the industrialized world. It is terribly employer or was not employee friendly, and makes it very difficult to organize. And that's the history of it. That's exactly what happened. You know, we came out of the Depression. You had a good relatively good labor law. Taft-Hartley came in, and after that, it was, other than the major industries that were very much related to the war effort, we didn't have many strong unions, and then the public sector unions became the important part of the labor movement. The industrial unions were weakened increasingly by offshoring. You know, I think it's a very difficult time for the labor movement. I am a labor person. You can see my sign, look in the back.
UAW sign in the back.
Yes, I was a UAW. My first job was a UAW as an auto worker. So I think that the American labor movement is trying to do things better. There are improvements going on. But being here in DC and being around the International Union headquarters and the people, and down at Georgetown, the Kalmanovitz, is very close ties with the labor movement. I think it's privately, we sort of say, you know, it's okay, but it's still not very strong. And I think increasingly with the changes in employment, where you get more precarious employment, part-time employment, contingent employment, those workers are very difficult to organize and to keep in a union. You know, that's the whole question of Starbucks and trying to organize them. And it's easier to organize Amazon, but there's a lot of resistance. But you get into these types of work organizations that are precarious. It becomes very, very difficult.
Let me ask a Kotkin question here. You know, Joel, one of Joel's insights is that we're kind of reorganizing ourselves in a way that looks very feudal, where we have, you know, a relatively small number of highly, you know, rich, concentrated power among employers who basically are the new feudal overlords controlling the people as well as the money. But it doesn't sound like the people want to be controlled. It sounds like there's kind of a, you know, underpinning here of, I don't want your stinking overlord stuff. Joel, what's your sense of this?
Is it a rebellion, or are people just checking out?
I think Joel is right on the mark. I think it's a form of resistance. Idleness can be a form of resistance.
That's right.
And to exactly what is happening. So I'm with Joel. This is going to be a period where it's not a sit-down strike in the old-fashioned labor way, but it's a type of idleness and resistance to this. And this particular discussion is going on all over the place with employers, Wall Street Journal. Everybody started talking about, well, what's wrong with these young people? They don't want to work. What's wrong with them? Which has a familiar tone to it for us that are old enough and grew up in the 60s. You know, that it's a critique that doesn't understand exactly what is happening in terms of the changes of employment and work and the future of work. So it just condemns the employees or the workers or the kids or the young people. So
this kind of passive aggressive attitude, though, I mean, let's talk about it from a China point of view. When you're dealing with
what does President Xi do about this?
Say that again.
What does President Xi do about this?
Right. Well, that's exactly the question I'm asking. Is you've got a country that is kind of expected to produce, right? That's its niche in the world is we will provide the goods. Increasingly, maybe we will provide the capital so that Vietnam and Cambodia can do the actual production. But nonetheless, it still is a lot of production coming out of China. It's their strategic hallmark, you know, strength. What do you do when your people are basically saying, "I don't want to, you know, I don't want to do 996."
Well, basically, I mean, in terms of the way you phrase that, you industrially upgrade, right? And a lot of, I think, what we're talking about, especially relating to what I understand of John's work, is that the U.S. was lousy at this from the 80s onwards. As we deindustrialized, we didn't find a way to retrain our workforce. Germany, by the way, does this excellently.
Mhm.
It has some other problems, whether we're talking, modern history or recent economic policies. But in terms of workforce and this whole thing about management labor relations, I mean, all my experiences with Germany is I'm just blown away how well they manage that. Yeah, and so they make, so like labor is part of the board of directors, even if they aren't shareholders, and it's a stakeholder economy. You get that in Northern Europe. So within the Western model, I mean, we're sometimes, biased towards our home country, which is the world's largest economy and does set the tone. But there is a variation. To also, before answering the question directly, to just pick up on feudalism, it's very interesting. In China, they still struggle with that notion. So the average Chinese talks about this all the time because they look at Xi. In fact, they look at the whole Chinese government even before Xi, and it's not referred to as a communist government like we do, which is an accurate appraisal of what is essentially a Leninist, state capitalist system in China. But they call it Wangchao, which means the empire, the imperial court. And they always refer to China having Fengjin Shehui, which actually is readopted from a Japanese version of a Chinese concept, but it means literally feudal society. So the Chinese consider themselves as much constrained by their history and civilizational culture as they do by specific policies. Now getting towards, kind of what is Xi doing about this and what is the ruling dynasty, if you want to call it that, or party, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, doing. They've actually, I mean, to me, taken exactly the wrong tact. So just real quickly, 3 parts. One, because it's a general policy. 2, because they're gender-specific kind of attitudes, at least. So the policy goes back about 10 years, infamous Document 9, which was announced during National People's Congress secretly, never revealed to the public, but then leaked. And this basically said, look, we're going to prohibit civil society. We're going to clamp down on any form of dissent. We're going to control the media beyond how we've already been controlling it. And we're going to reject Western values. Oh, and also there's this campaign against what they call historical nihilism, which is basically historical reflection, like acknowledging the mistakes of the past to do something better for the future. So China kind of, along with Xi's whole range of policies, is trying to work against the tide of history, which is, fundamentally problematic. Now, in terms of what that means to the youth, when you start saying reject Western values, that kind of means, don't modernize. And so they have been trying to inculcate these Confucian values, this nationalistic agenda, which they do have some followers. This is the interesting thing. I mean, just like to use a negative example from Germany, Nazi youth was a thing. And you could get a whole society behind an awful, fundamentally inhumane set of policies because you did target the youth in many ways. But what China's done, instead of trying to kind of bring them into the fold, which it does in a way, but it's gone after 2 gender identities, okay? So one is that we heard a lot more about recently, but this is a big part of that Tangping lying flat and checking out, and that is they first went after women with the notion of leftover women, 剩女, leftover women. So there was the women, like if you're not married and getting pregnant by the age of 28, you're like an old maid kind of thing, which is just bizarre, along with not acknowledging a woman's ability to create a career, right? How if you're supposed to both develop your career and be this matriarch before the age of 30, I mean, it's kind of the impossible ask here. And so that's what you see in more modern societies, according to our contemporary definitions. Women have children later, or they can even look at other options. Well, but in China, the whole thing was a backlash against women trying to have a life outside the family. So that was one thing. And the other gender-specific kind of clampdown that was anti-youth was this one I love. It's Nyang Pao. This hostility towards Nyang Pao. And Nyang Pao we translate in English as sissy boy. And so it was like the BTS types, right? So if you were, and well, we've celebrated that, right? So everything from what Led Zeppelin represented, with this kind of feminine masculinity of the, rock stars of the 70s to, David Beckham and the metrosexual, the kind of Asian version of that came from K-pop and these sort of, beautified boys, or boyish looking male actors and singers. Anyway, there was actually an active campaign, politically run campaign against that in China. So just tying, I know there's a lot of big topics, but I'm trying to show that there's a fundamental disconnect between an older generation and the young generation, and the older generation, knowingly or not, has kind of made the future generation its enemy. And this goes beyond what we saw, during like the anti-war protests of the 60s and 70s and that kind of rift in society, which was ultimately healed through natural processes. China has made it, political dissent or any sort of social voicing of opinion, if it in any way infringes on what the Communist Party considers its rights, which it's now since Document 9 said is everything, you really made it unattractive, put it that way.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of kind of manly men or
manly men, yes,
is kind of a, well, you think about kind of the strength of the blue collar MAGA supporters, right, and their view of manliness in that same kind of a sense of what constitutes a good, solid occupation and living.
Yeah.
And there may be some crossover there. I don't know. What do you think, John?
I think, sure, your work ethic is shaped, by individuals' personal life, their experiences, their work history, their professional associations, education, culture, family heritage, and religious affiliation, which are all very clearly important in shaping the work ethic. But a lot of those issues are now declining. You take religion, which is very prominent in American work history, is declining. Okay, it's not just the Protestant work ethic, it's Catholic work ethic, Jewish work history. I mean, it's everywhere. And I think that, so modernization, as it's popularly called, has, I want to try to put it in kind of the words that Rob did. It influenced the conceptualization of work and grounded in perfection that used to be in the goodness of labor and the necessity of hard work. I think that's kind of what Rob was saying about what's happened in China, but that's the sort of American experience. But it's obviously led to a real political crisis that's going on between generations, which there's some of it always has happened. I remember my dad telling the 60s John, that you guys just don't know what hard work is. Here's like a man who came out of the Depression, worked damn hard. And so there is that sort of tension between the various ages.
Well, there has to be, the thing that strikes me listening to both of you is that obviously there is an implicit social contract that says you've got to be part of society, you've got to work hard so that everybody, including you, can do better. But I wonder whether or not we just have gotten to a world of just institutionalized narcissism, where it's really just about you. It isn't about anybody else. It's just about you. And incidentally, if you happen to help other people, well, fine, but it doesn't really matter. And I wonder whether this is really what's taken over from a values perspective, both in the U.S. and in China.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, discussions like this, I sort of go back to my teaching days and talking to people about work, and especially from people who were industrial workers. And there's a type of class resentment about this discussion about work, okay? These people who are telling us we don't work hard enough, we got to work harder, what do they do for a living? where do they work? Where do they live? And there's it is a resentment. And I think that is continuing to simmer underneath this. And I think it's sort of shaped politics as we know it today. It's not necessarily the way people like myself or of the left would have wanted it, but it's certainly part of the right. That you talk to the MAGA people, and they don't like Wall Street. They don't like business corporations. They all want to be, freed from that system. It's kind of hard to think about that, and who, and that sort of simmering resentment. It's not just the employer, but the woke generation, us. What do we do for a living? You're a word merchant. You're out there. What do you do with your hands, or what do you? There's this class resentment. I mean, leaving Youngstown and going back to it and hearing that and watch. Joel knows my sort of background. Youngstown was the major Democratic stronghold in Ohio. It is all Republican now. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see any signs other than Trump signs. And this is a year before the election.
But John, so it's actually not Republican, it's MAGA, right? Which is kind of a Republican identity is being fought over, but it's MAGA, right?
Yeah, it is MAGA. But and there is, but the liberal or middle of the road Republicans in Ohio are being completely shaped by that group.
And that group has what your point, I think, is that group has an underlying cynicism about the world that we're in, about the distribution
and deservedly so, I would add.
Yeah, right. And it sounds to me, Rob, what you're saying is there is a similar level of cynicism. Maybe it's brewing,
but how does
it doesn't express itself as well, because the state comes down on you too hard if you do express it. Happening in China, and you just kind of wonder, well, what's the future here?
Well, I think it's yes to respond to your point there, but to put it also in some context. I love the fact you brought up narcissism. I think we're getting it at multiple levels across societies, China, the U.S., and in a similar fashion. It's maybe more pronounced in the U.S. because Trump is obviously, the narcissist par excellence.
On steroids.
But on steroids. In fact, what I love is how I've always been amazed of those, those posters that show Trump, his head superimposed on a buff body, and the guy is so out of shape. But that's how he's perceived, right? It's like there is so much wishful thinking in the MAGA movement. But in any case, the narcissism among the base is considered okay because that's just rewards. That's like, that Protestant work ethic being, in the Puritan sense, rewarded from the Almighty, because Trump is, he whether or not he really is, he defines himself as an entrepreneur. And he identifies with, for example, he's very much associated with white nationalists, but he has these successful Black entrepreneurs in his camp. So, Herschel Walker famously, because, through his own, whatever you think about Herschel Walker, through his own grit and determination and talent, achieved what he achieved. They hate another Black like Obama because he represents that elitist globalist class, which is also narcissistic, to I think Joel's point, so it's like the left also has a narcissism problem. I think generally relating it to what you guys look at on your podcast, corporate America is extremely narcissistic. This is, 1950s corporate America. There was a sense of, we need to provide for our workers. The ratio of CEO pay to entry-level worker pay was much narrower. I mean, Jeff Bezos doesn't know what to do with his money, so he's flying people into space and considering himself, contributing to humanity. Meanwhile, we have people at, kind of below poverty level income in the inner city, as if they never thought, oh, hey, I could be using, and I'm not going to take a political stance here, but I'm just saying that disconnect between social reality and what these guys consider a legitimate use of their gains from the system is phenomenal. It's even more contradictory, of course, in China, which is technically communist. But the elite there, I mean, that's where, although we have more millionaires here, despite popular opinion, I've actually looked up the statistic recently. So like China has just under 1 million millionaires when we have 5 million or so. And then, of course, when you get into the billionaires, we have even more. But in any case, in China, you have this deification of the likes of a Pony Ma, Jack Ma, the successful entrepreneurs. But a lot of them are also like Xi, they've risen through political connections. So it's almost like what we have here on left and right, the globalist elite, which are kind of through their, intelligentsia or government connections versus those who kind of, created their own wealth. But they're again distant from what we're talking about today, that general population of ordinary citizens, where when the economy was roaring in China, that wasn't such an issue. But now as it's begun, you've had from this year, India surpassed China's population. They have a declining birth rate, growing age dependency ratio, and you've got the work conditions we've been discussing. It's like, why would you want to, throw yourself into that with a career? And you've got these narcissistic leaders, whether they're government or business, and you're so far from the top. And then they're going to say, it's like, you're lucky to get this minimally paying, extraordinarily difficult job just to be part of the labor force. It's like, why not just stay at home with mom and dad, which, by the way, is another feature of Chinese society. They don't kick you out of your house like they do here, at least as I experienced, and probably many people can relate to. It's like, once you're out of high school, it's like, you figure it out, kid. So anyway,
but it does, and we're going to have to wrap here in a second, but it does bring you to the clear conclusion that it's not at all surprising, given the environment both in the U.S. and in China, that youth are less interested in putting themselves into that into that kind of world than they have been in the past.
And it's not just the youth, as John talked about. I don't know if this is true in China, but a lot of times it's older workers who decide not to go back to work, right? Isn't that something you run into, John?
Yep, absolutely. And that was the phenomena that people here in Washington talk about in terms of the pandemic, is that, well, what happened to the workforce is that so many people came to the conclusion it's not worth it.
Right.
What's more important is my family, my health, my children. I'm going to quit. And I think that's, I think we're going to see more of that. But I'm caught two ways on this, guys. On the one hand, I think there is a lot of individual decision-making like that. But at the same time, if you look at what's happened in terms of corporate structures and what's happening and cutbacks, and, part of this is being driven by what's actually happening in corporations and businesses as they downsize and replace with technology. So I think, and then the other part of that is the defunding that's happened in terms of the public sector.
Well, gentlemen, this has been an absolutely fabulous conference. I don't think we're going to be able to solve this one on our own, but we certainly will be able to.
As for the next episode.
That's right. The next episode. Wait for the cliffhanger. But this is the reason why we're studying all of this, and why it's fascinating to have you guys part of the Feudal Future podcast. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to doing a follow-up.
Thank you.
Sounds great.
The Feudal